So when you're in management and your role is to help your people resolve conflict, why? So they can be more productive, so they can accomplish the tasks that they get paid to accomplish. And yes, you want to resolve conflict because it reduces the stress that you have, because management is not about doing tasks or procedures or protocols. No, management is about managing people, and that's all psychology. So in your role as a manager, when you have a conflict between departments, a conflict between branch offices, a conflict between individuals, and specifically, if you're CEO, if you're in senior leadership, then you're going to run into situations where you have conflict between other leaders. Well, how do you resolve the conflict? Well, you resolve the conflict by getting people to listen. Now, that's way too simplistic, but listen. Most people don't know how to listen when they're in a conflict situation. The reason for that is because neurologically, the brain is producing a number of different biochemicals. So in psychology, this is what we do, is we learn how they're called activation loops or biofeedback loops work. And one of those very important biochemicals is adrenaline or norepinephrine. So if I'm in a conflict situation with somebody else and I'm not listening to them, I'm only listening to myself, I'm only listening to my own thoughts, I'm being self-preservationalist. If the other person's only listening to their thoughts, if they're only listening to their perception, if they're being equally self-preservationalist, then we're not going to come to any sort of resolution. We're just going to have antagonism. And the trouble is, when antagonism continues, the brain produces more of these biochemicals, and pretty much things get out of control. Maybe the easiest way to look at this is if you've got a couple, you've got, say, a husband and a wife, and they're in an argument, but they're not listening to each other. They're just thinking about their own perception. How do you get people to resolve conflict? Well, you as a manager, you have to, as we said in the last video, eliminate the ignorance. And the ignorance is, I don't know what the other person's perception is. How do you eliminate the ignorance? You have to get them to listen. Okay, that's simplistic. But see, listening can just be a physical activity. In other words, I go, I'm listening. And we've all been in situations like that when we've said to the other party we're in conflict with, are you even listening to me? And they go, I'm listening. Well, their body language and their tone of voice says, no, they're not. Physically, the ears might be receiving auditory signals, but they're not giving consideration. So when we say your job as a manager is to get the parties to listen to each other, what I want you to understand is that you've got to get each party to give careful consideration to what the other person says, thinks, and feels. So I did a TED Talk on this. All you have to do is go to TED.com and search my name. You can find it. When we sit down with somebody we're in conflict with, and when we make a purposeful decision that we are going to take the time and give careful consideration to what the other person says, thinks, and feels, what's probably going to happen is we're going to come to the conclusion that there was some sort of miscommunication on my part. Now, communication is a two-way street. Communication, this is what we teach in Ararat Consulting in our communication workshops with executives. We say communication is to understand and be understood. I need to understand you, and you need to understand me. We need to understand and be understood. But if we're not listening, if we're not giving careful consideration to how each party is thinking, and just not just the words you're saying, but the feeling that goes behind them. In other words, when we're looking at conflict, conflict isn't just a cerebral form of antagonism. Conflict is virtually always mental, emotional, and even spiritual. And when we say spiritual, we're not talking about sitting around in a circle singing Kumbaya or having a seance. No, spiritual is whether or not you trust me, whether or not you have faith in me, whether or not you think I'm reliable. Those are all aspects of the spiritual component of our psyche. So in holistic medicine, we don't just focus on the physical. This is what my TED talks about. Doctors all too often just focus on the physical. They don't look at the mental, emotional, and spiritual. If you want to be an extremely effective manager, an extremely effective CEO, when you're dealing with conflict, if you can start to look at things from a medical approach that's holistic medicine, and you can start to consider the mental, emotional, and spiritual components of each party's psyche, you know what? You're going to solve a lot of conflict.